So the hunt for Charlie Kirk's killer is underway, and as of recording, no suspects are in custody. The identity of the shooter remains unknown, but the FBI did just release the first photos to the public. Before we get into all that, I want to start at the beginning, right? What happened yesterday while Kirk was speaking at Utah Valley University. It was meant to be the first of 15 stops on his American Comeback Tour, which his organization Turning Point USA described as being aimed at giving students the tools to push back against left-wing indoctrination in academia and reclaim their right to free speech. And then with that, you saw the event taking the format that he's probably best known for, which is the Prove Me Wrong segment, in which he invites attendees to ask him questions, debate him, and otherwise try and prove him wrong. Right? And the clips from those interactions, they rack up millions and millions of views each on social media. Then instead, what we saw yesterday is that roughly 20 minutes into the event, someone asked, "Do you know how many transgender Americans have been mass shooters over the last 10 years? Kirk answers, "Too many." And the same audience member goes on to say that the number is 5. And then that person asking Kirk how many mass shooters there have been in general in America over the past 10 years, with Kirk asking counting or not counting gang violence. And then he got shot in the neck. As we talked about yesterday, it was horrific. If you have not seen it, I do not recommend you go look at it. His head snapped back. There's blood pouring out. There was panic, screaming, shouting. Some people took covers. Some people ran. And then within a couple of hours, it was confirmed that Kirk had been killed. And Utah Valley University told students on campus to take shelter inside until they could be escorted out by police. Right? And actually with that, it's now being said that they've closed their campus and canceled classes for at least the rest of the week. Then what we saw is that by the end of the day, 2 people had been taken into custody, but both ended up being released without being charged in relation to the shooting. Though notably, you had FBI Director Kash Patel prematurely writing on X that the subject of the horrific shooting that took the life of Charlie Kirk was in custody. And with that, you had places like the New York Times noting that that was unusual that the FBI director would personally take the lead in releasing information about the shooting, and even more unusual that he chose to share the information minutes before state and local officials were scheduled to provide a press briefing. And then actually, with that, you had Patel having to walk back his earlier claim and announce that the subject in custody has been released after an interrogation by law enforcement, and adding, "Our investigation continues and we will continue to release information in interest of transparency." Also, I'll say that around that time, the idea that the shooter was in custody had already been accepted by many, and in fact, there was a video of a man briefly detained after the shooting that led to false claims that a Canadian man bearing his resemblance was the shooter. And that rumor reportedly originated from an account on X called Fox 11 Reno, though that doesn't actually have any relation to the real Fox News. And so instead, it looked like it was an account that aimed to capitalize on the lack of information around the shooter and try to get traffic to the website and generate some ad revenue. But then I'll say, with so much wrong information out there and just unknown about what's happening, we got to talk about exactly what we do and do not know. Starting with what we do know is that authorities believe that the shooter fired from a rooftop. And with that, you have videos recorded before and after the shooting showing a person on the roof of a building more than 100 yards from where Kirk was standing. In one video, you have someone saying they saw someone run across the roof and lie down. And then in a second video, the person can be seen rushing away from that spot immediately after the shooting. And then with that, you had the FBI saying in a press briefing this morning that they'd been able to track the movements of the suspected shooter all the way from him arriving on campus, going up a stairwell and getting onto the roof, to jumping off the roof and fleeing into a neighborhood after he took the shot. You also had the agency releasing a photo of the suspect and asking for the public's help in identifying the person, and in fact, offering a reward of up to $100,000 for information leading to the suspect's arrest. Also, you had them saying that they found a high-powered bolt-action rifle in a wooded area near the scene. And with that, you had the Wall Street Journal reporting that investigators found ammunition engraved with expressions of transgender and anti-fascist ideology inside that rifle. And actually, a senior law enforcement official with direct knowledge of the investigation reportedly told the New York Times that this had not been verified by ATF analysts, did not match other summaries of the evidence, and might turn out to have been misread or misinterpreted. Though with that, I will say, at least as of recording, that detail has not been publicly confirmed by authorities yet. And so then with all that, as of recording, officials have not released an official motive regarding the shooting. But then with all that said, let's move on to the response, reactions, and sort of the fallout that we've been seeing since. And we'll start with President Trump, who first wrote on Truth Social, "No one understood or had the heart of the youth in the United States of America better than Charlie. He was loved and admired by all, especially me, and now he is no longer with us." And then with that, you had Trump announcing that American flags would be flown at half-staff, and adding that he'd be awarding Kirk a posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom award. You also had other Republicans and members of the administration coming out and singing Kirk's praises, including RFK Jr., Pete Hegseth, Pam Bondi, Mike Johnson, and J.D. Vance, who actually went to Utah today to pay respect to Kirk's family. But then also outside of the responses expressing condolences or praising Kirk, you had people blaming the left for what happened, with, for example, Elon Musk maybe being the most prominent voice there, writing, "The left is the party of murder." And you had Musk also responding exactly to a post that said, "The left-wing mainstream media, as well as figures like Gavin Newsom claiming Trump plans to be dictator, has created a climate of hysteria against right-wing figures that could radicalize any number of unstable people to engage in political violence." Right? And then adding to that, you had the likes of right-wing influencer Laura Loomer, who has been known to have influence over Trump, not only blaming the left, but calling on Trump to crack down on them. Writing, "It's time for the Trump administration to shut down, defund, and prosecute every single leftist organization. More people will be murdered if the left isn't crushed with the power of the state. It's time for the full power of the executive branch to come crashing down on the heads of news companies and media personalities who incite political violence in our country." And a very big thing with that is you had many saying that's sort of the tone that we saw Trump taking in his remarks on Kirk's death last night.
For years, those on the radical left have compared wonderful Americans like Charlie to Nazis and the world's worst mass murderers and criminals. This kind of rhetoric is directly responsible for the terrorism that we're seeing in our country today, and it must stop right now. My administration will find each and every one of those who contributed to this atrocity and to other political violence, including the organizations that fund it and support it, as well as those who go after our judges, law enforcement officials, and everyone else who brings order to our country. From the attack on my life in Butler, Pennsylvania last year, which killed a husband and father, to the attacks on ICE agents, to the vicious murder of a healthcare executive in the streets of New York, to the shooting of House Majority Leader Steve Scalise and 3 others, radical left political violence has hurt too many innocent people and taken too many lives.
What I will say with that is that Trump is absolutely right in saying that political violence is a huge and growing problem in this country, though it is very clearly not a one-sided one. Last year, according to Capitol Police, there were 9,500 threats and concerning statements made against Congress members, their families, and their staff, up from 8,000 the year prior and up from less than 4,000 in 2017. And then as far as judges and prosecutors, you have the U.S. Marshal Service saying that threats against them reportedly doubled from 2021 to 2023. And then, of course, besides the threats, there's tons of stories that could have been mentioned, right? In addition to incidents mentioned by Trump, like his own assassination attempts, which are horrifying. Back in 2020, the Democratic governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, was the subject of a kidnapping plot. You then had the January 6th attack on the Capitol in 2021, with Trump pardoning everyone, whether they were violent or not. In 2022, Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked in their San Francisco home by a man wielding a hammer. In D.C., you've had armed men arrested and accused of heading toward the homes of Justice Brett Kavanaugh and former President Barack Obama with the intent to kill them. And I mean, this year, we had things like a guy who ran for the New Mexico legislature as a Republican being convicted for planning a politically motivated shooting spree against 4 Democratic officials. You had a guy shooting up the CDC after allegedly falling prey to misinformation about the COVID-19 vaccine. And you had a guy with a list of dozens of other potential Democratic targets killing Minnesota's House Speaker Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark, while also wounding State Senator John Hoffman and his wife Yvette. You might remember after that, you had people like Republican Senator Mike Lee writing a mocking post on X saying "Nightmare on Wall Street," or with him also pushing conspiracy theories trying to blame that act of political violence on Marxists. And while the reactions online from everyday people, there's been a range of them in those situations and with this Kirk one. In response to Kirk's death, we've seen universal condemnation from the country's most prominent Democrats, including Obama, Biden, Harris, Bernie Sanders, AOC, Zoran Mamdani, and the list goes on. Right, all more or less saying political violence has no place in America and must be rejected in all forms. Now again, with that, to be very clear, it is not that no one is saying horrible stuff about Kirk's death. There are people that are out there celebrating, saying that he got what was coming to him, people pointing to his stance on gun control. Also with that, people posting this clip in particular that's been making the rounds.
I think it's worth to have a cost of, unfortunately, some gun deaths every single year so that we can have the Second Amendment to protect our other God-given rights. That is a prudent deal. It is rational.
Right, and in general, we've seen a lot of people yelling at each other. Right? In fact, we saw a shouting match break out in Congress yesterday with Mike Johnson pausing the House in the middle of a series of votes to call for a moment of silence and prayer for Kirk. And for around 30 seconds, people from both parties, they respected the moment of silence. But when Johnson tried to get things going again, Lauren Boebert started calling for him to have someone lead a spoken prayer for Kirk, who at the time was reported to be in critical condition. With Boebert saying, I believe, silent prayers get silent results. And then you had several Democrats objecting, pointing out that there was also a school shooting earlier in the day, which we'll also talk about soon, and saying that there was no prayer for those kids. But then you had Anna Paulina Luna, a Florida Republican who was close to Kirk, starting to angrily yell back, saying to Democrats, you all caused this. And then as other Republicans began yelling at Democrats, you had at least one Democrat responding, pass some gun laws. But then many noting that Utah, where Kirk was killed, it has some of the most relaxed gun laws in the country, allowing the purchase and possession of firearms in most cases without a permit or a license. And then also with that, you had people pointing to, in May, Utah lawmakers actually updating state law to allow the open carry of weapons with a permit on college campuses. Though with that, I want to say we do not know if stricter gun laws there at this time would have actually helped in this specific case. But ultimately, that is where we are right now, and we're going to see how this plays out, what more information we get, what happens with this manhunt. And so for now, I'll end this with essentially what I said yesterday and a little bit today. I think this is horrific, disgusting, wrong, no matter our differences of opinion and in politics. I denounce political violence, and I'm sending my thoughts, my well wishes, and my prayers to Charlie's family and loved ones. And also as far as the situation as a whole, I hope and pray that there can be a cooling down, a dialogue, but I also fear that what has happened is going to be used to unleash horror. But for now, we'll have to wait and see. But then also, I mentioned that we would talk about the other news of the day, and that includes that as the news about Charlie Kirk was playing out, we saw headlines about a school shooting in the suburbs of Denver. In there, the suspect's a male student who reportedly opened fire and injured 2 other students before taking his own life at Evergreen High School. You had both victims initially considered in critical condition, though one was eventually in stable condition by the early evening. You also had some local outlets saying that another student was injured, though that wasn't from gunshot wounds. Instead, that was from trying to escape escaped the school. And as far as what we know happened, you had officers receiving a call of an active shooter at around 12:30, and they arrived at the school in 2 minutes. The men encountering the shooter within 5, though they reportedly didn't use their weapons. And reportedly, there were hundreds of witnesses to what happened, and right now we don't know if the victims shot were specifically targeted. And it's also unclear where the shooting started, but you have investigators saying that shots were fired both in and outside of the building. And right now, there's still an ongoing investigation into this person and their locker, car, home, and social media. It's all going to be looked at to identify a motive. Today, you also had the authorities identifying the 16-year-old suspect and saying that he was radicalized by an extremist network, though they didn't elaborate any further on that. The whole thing obviously terrifying students in the community, with also the New York Times speaking to one mother who received a text from her teen daughter saying, "Someone just shot up the school, Mom. I'm so scared, Mom." With that mom then saying that she just vomited from how crazy it was. You also had reports of things saying that students who heard the shots, they were running in every direction away from the school. And you had things like 18 of them reportedly making it to a nearby house and pounding on the door, asking for help, with that person that lived there telling local news, they're a retired educator, his wife's a retired nurse, and they took them in. In all of this, given everything that we're seeing, it has people underscoring the issue of school shootings. According to reports, there have been 47 so far this year, which have killed 19 people and injured 77 others. There was one in Minnesota just 2 weeks ago, and Evergreen High School, the site of yesterday's shooting, it's actually in the same district as the Columbine High School. And so with that, you also had Tracy Dorlin, the superintendent of the district, issuing a statement saying, "We cannot pretend this is just another tragic incident. The pain of this incident reopens old wounds. I know there are many in our Jeffco community hurting and grieving tonight in Evergreen and beyond. The urgency this moment demands is undeniable." And adding, "We all know expressions of support, condolences, and gratitude are not enough. The nation is tired of statements filled with platitudes and thoughts and prayers. What we need is courage. What we need is the collective will of our entire community. Violence involving our young people should never be normalized, and we must face the difficult truth that too often it is." And that is, you had the governor of Colorado writing, "No family should ever fear for their child's life as they send them to school." And ultimately, for now, that's where we are on this obviously bleak story. But the next up in the news from that, we have to talk about Trump's FBI, because these allegations in this new lawsuit are very interesting. Because this lawsuit, it comes from 3 fired senior officials who are taking FBI Director Kash Patel, Attorney General Pam Bondi, and the entire federal government to court. And this over what they called a campaign of retribution for their perceived failure to demonstrate sufficient political loyalty to the president. And this is a big deal, not only because it's the first lawsuit from former FBI agents challenging their firings, but also because it looks like it paints a certain picture of Kash Patel and his deputy director, Dan Bongino. Or because you have places like the New York Times saying it describes these right-wing influencers with far less experience than any of their predecessors as almost cartoonish figures more interested in social media or handing out oversized challenge coins and running the day-to-day operations of the nation's flagship law enforcement agency. And as far as those alleged challenge coins, apparently Patel had these large tokens minted with his own name printed on them, with the S in cash being a $sign. And according to the lawsuit, when one of the plaintiffs received this coin, he also noticed a collection of whiskey bottles and cigars on the director's desk. So with that said, let's get into the more serious accusations. Starting with the first and most senior plaintiff, Brian Driscoll, a widely respected professional who worked at the agency for 2 decades and eventually became Trump's acting FBI director before Patel got confirmed.